Hello learners, I'm Dr. Shubhangi Vaidya from the School of Interdisciplinary and Transdisciplinary Studies. In this lecture, we shall be talking about the third unit in the course MGPE 009 pertaining to livelihood, culture, lifestyle and environment. The aims and objectives of this lecture are basically to try and understand the impact of globalization upon culture, lifestyles and livelihoods. We will also try to understand the impact and discuss the impact of unsustainable consumption patterns on the environment. And we will try to understand the Gandhian alternative to unsustainable and environmentally harmful global trends. As you have probably understood, learned and read in the previous units of this course, globalization is a process of integrating society, economy, polity and technology across national borders and cultures. It encompasses the exchange of ideas, thoughts, processes, people, transfer of technology and knowledge. Globalization, in fact, has been the reality of our age, and it has become something so ubiquitous that we really cannot envisage how the world was in a pre-globalization era. Modern economics, as you also know, is based on models of consumption and on the concept of economic globalization. And this has introduced many nations in the world to neoliberal economic patterns, and India, of course, is no exception to this. Unfortunately, however, we see that the liberalization process in developing countries, including India, has led to glaring inequalities between nations and people in terms of their consumption and livelihood patterns. The liberalization of the economy has in fact resulted in a perception and adoption of a lifestyle that is very different from the lifestyle that existed in the pre-modern period. This is basically a consumerist lifestyle that directly reflects upon the overuse of existing resources. If we look at the history of the world, we'll find that human communities all over the world have existed in tandem with or in adjustment with the natural world around them. But in the present scenario, we find that natural resources, the natural world, is no longer a limitation. In fact, human beings have done their utmost to overcome the limits placed by natural resources and have tapped and exploited these resources to the maximum extent possible. Therefore, there is an urgent need for introspection as to why humankind has strayed away from sustainable and ecologically sensible lifestyles and practices. We really need to rethink the way in which we are living in our world, the way in which we are harming our world, and thereby harming the future of the planet and the future of the human race itself. It would be a good idea to start by talking a little bit about Indian culture and environmental values. What is the background that we come from? What are the intellectual and the cultural resources that our society has always possessed? We find that ancient Indian civilization propounded the dictum of living in harmony with nature. We find that the religious texts like the Vedas, Upanishads, etc., prescribed a life that was free of wants and desires and which perpetuated the doctrines of compassion and love towards all other living beings. We find that the earth, water, sky, air, plants and animals all were considered expressions of the divine. They were worshipped, and any harm to them was considered as a sinful act. Also, the natural calamities like droughts, floods, lightning, earthquakes, These were taken as violent forms of anger manifested by the gods and goddesses. So in a sense, we find that nature was given the status of something divine, of a divine force that could harm you if you acted against it. However, if you went along with it, if you respected natural laws, if you respected the creations of nature, nature could be bountiful, nature could be good. As we all know the famous dictum, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, all the creatures of the earth are one family. Ahimsa Paramo Dharma, that is, the best form of duty or dharma is non-violence, and also the concept of saving trees, because trees are believed to be embodying or encapsulating those values of life which are so very important to the human community. These are some of the preachings that demonstrate the ancient values towards environment. As we've mentioned before, non-violence and compassion to all creatures are environmental values which are seen in all religious systems of India. Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, and so on. All these religions embody the concept of compassion towards other living beings. We find that the legacy of these values was very much a part and parcel of our way of life. However, till the process of industrialization and mechanism made inroads into the lives and activities of people, we find that these values were really the ones that human beings lived by. We find, however, that with industrialization, urbanization, modernization, we find the values of materialism, acquisition, and promotion of consumerism have become prevalent globally. The influence of the West in this regard has been very, very significant. And we find that the interlinking or the interlinkages of economies across the world as a consequence of globalization has further strengthened the belief in these values. Gandhi had famously said, and I quote, "God forbid that India should ever take to industrialism after the manner of the West. If an entire nation of 300 million took to similar economic exploitation, it would strip the world bare like locusts." Unquote. This is an oft-repeated quotation, and it really bears repetition to this day, because Gandhi had, in a sense, forewarned India about the dangers of a path of economic development that was exploitative of nature, that did not care for conservation, that did not care for respecting natural resources. He had also added that the distinguishing character of modern civilization is an indefinite multiplicity of wants, negating the spirit of restriction or regulating of these wants. So untrammeled desires and fulfillment of those desires is really the hallmark or the watchword of contemporary civilization, and Gandhi warned against this. We find that development in India, which has followed the path of industrialization, urbanization, and modernization, has also been accompanied by major income inequalities, and these are reflected in the lifestyle of its people. It has been aptly remarked that more than the growth of its population, it is the adoption of a consumerist lifestyle based upon the Western model that has raised alarming concerns. The historian and environmental critic Ramchandra Guha has very aptly remarked, "India is in many ways an ecological disaster zone, marked by high rates of deforestation, species loss, land degradation, air and water pollution." These remarks made by Guha in the year 2006 are very, very relevant even in 2020. We find that the creation of a Western lifestyle would lead to a huge increase in the per capita consumption of water, electricity, greater usage of electronic gadgets like refrigerators, microwaves, and so on, which have in a sense become the very, very basic essentials in a sense of contemporary urban living. For instance, think of a washing machine. Think of the amount of water that it consumes. Certainly, it is a labor-saving device, but in terms of use of water, which is a precious natural resource, we find that water is used in a very, very excessive and unsustainable way by these devices. We find that pollution of air and water, unscientific techniques of garbage disposal, overuse of groundwater cause huge economic and environmental damage and loss. And unfortunately, the kind of consumerist culture that we find around us today is contributing hugely to these kinds of environmental losses and damage. If we take the case, for instance, of urban vehicles or vehicles all over the country, we find traffic jams and bottlenecks which are a part of our day-to-day life. These alone result in a colossal wastage of our petroleum fuels, and the losses incurred run into crores. The consumerist culture, we find, is reinforced by the presence of multinational corporations and their wide range of products that lure the customers into further spree of acquisition. Advertising is a huge industry today, and we find that the advertising of products that in a sense are luxury products, products which are aspirational, that people like to acquire in order to show their social status rather than to fulfill any want. This really is the order of the day and has been very aptly written. We find that they create a sense of lack in people who no longer interact nor live in natural surroundings, but instead are conditioned to their meaningless jobs just to be paid, conditioned by television boxes or computer screens to live in the unreal world of consumption, unquote. In other words, we find that human life in the contemporary world is really divorced or is really separated from nature, and our lives really are just inscribed by or trapped in this cycle of consumption. And this further takes us away from natural surroundings, from the natural world. Harsh said, "Consumer culture is not just a phenomenon by which we all buy more than we ought to. It is a specific mentality and a way of thinking that invades life at nearly all levels. It is a national creed and condition of living. Its detrimental effects must be viewed in terms of possible alternatives so that we can have a better idea of whether the creed of consumerism warrants change," unquote. In other words, consumerism is not just about buying more and more products. Consumerism is an entire attitude. It is a way of engaging with the world. It brings in its wake many, many psychological, spiritual, and emotional costs, because the world of things, the world of consumption, really is all that we have in the present times. Consumption for the basic needs is of course necessary. However, consumption beyond the basic needs, merely to fulfill our psychological needs, has a negative impact on the ecological resource management. Let's talk now about the social, cultural, and economic dimensions of consumerism. In the 1990s, economic liberalization opened up the Indian economy to the world and set in motion a number of changes. The process of globalization opened India up to a variety of goods, products, services, and technologies. The setting up of business and manufacturing units by the multinational companies also led to an economic boom. Employment opportunities in the IT sector, in multinational corporations, and other private and business houses led to a higher per capita income and offered a better standing of living compared to the previous generation. It is often said by the previous generations that to acquire household items like fans or cookers or any other thing which the current generation takes as a very, very basic necessity, there is a huge difference in the way our parents lived out their lives and the way the current generation and the generation of our children is leading their lives. We find that those goods and items of consumption which were unheard of in earlier times are very much a part of everyday living. The government policies also, which facilitated modernization of various sectors, leading to increasing FDI, that is foreign direct investment. We find the mushrooming of shopping complexes and malls in every nook and corner, not just in the metropolitan centers, but these days even every smaller Indian city has got malls and shopping centers. And this, of course, is at the expense of environmental degradation. This new culture, however, and this is very important to note, coexists with millions of people who continue to struggle for the bare necessities. So on the one hand, you have a consumerist culture where people want to buy more and more consumer items, and side by side, you have many people who still have not been able to emerge out of the trap of poverty and who are as yet unable to fulfill their basic wants for a decent life. Therefore, the process which was intended to facilitate an overall growth and well-being of the nation has failed to deal with poverty levels and, of course, has further enhanced inequalities between the haves and the have-nots. And at a social level, it has come to signify an individual's better purchasing capacity, lifestyle, and new prosperity. So today it is not just enough to own a car or to own a smartphone. We are concerned with the brand, we are concerned about the value, we are concerned about whether it is new, and so on and so forth. So this kind of aspirational agenda to own, to show off better and better quality goods, consumption items, has become very much a part of our everyday lives. The easy availability of credits, loans from commercial banks, and a minimum rate of interest, increasing per capita income, and the urge to possess products have brought about a significant change in consumer mindsets. So if I want a new product, I no longer have to save for it. I can use my credit card, I can take a loan, and I can instantly gratify my desire. The middle class now has a higher income and a higher standard of living than ever before, and therefore has unlimited access to products from the world over, ranging from cosmetics to cars to cell phones to electronic devices and so on and so forth. Along with this, we find that there is a rise in nuclear families, and we find that a disproportionately higher consumption of energy and water. As living units become nuclear and more families start living separately, naturally their needs of consumption of basic resources like energy and so on is also going to multiply. Increasing number of telephone connections, cell phone subscriptions, internet usage, and use of other electronic gadgets have become the yardstick of development. Of course, all this is bound to have a deleterious impact on the environment. Ramchandra Guha very appropriately asks, can the world as a whole achieve American levels of ownership? Can there be a world with 4 billion cars, a China with 700 million cars, and India with 600 million cars? Where will the oil and gas to run them come from? The metals to build them with? The tar to drive them on? I take the car here as merely indexical of a certain style of consumption, unquote. Current levels of consumption and production are 25% higher than the Earth's ecological capacity, with the richest 15% of the world population accounting for 56% of the world's total consumption, while the poorest 40% account for only 11%, as per the report of the European Commission in 2002. Another great menace is e-waste, which is generated from electronic goods. This is non-recyclable, and the dumping of electronic wastes in open sites is also producing damaging effects on human health and environment. Let's talk now about the possibility of sustainable consumption. The use of goods and services that respond to basic needs and bring a better quality of life while minimizing the use of natural resources, toxic materials and emissions of waste and pollutants over the life cycle so as not to jeopardize the needs of future generations. Is such a consumption which is sustainable in nature, which does not harm the future generations, a possibility? We find that technical improvements in energy-saving options for household gadgets like refrigerators that consume minimum energy levels is being explored across the world. Very important here is the promotion of effective means of public transport in place of personal cars and vehicles. This would not just help to decongest urban spaces, but would also lead to a sustainable use of fuels for transportation purposes. An important thing to bear in mind is the need to give due powers and finances to local agencies and associations to develop solid waste management, energy-effective devices, and instruments that help in managing the environmental decay and urban problems being faced today. At the level of individual actions, there are many ways we can bring about in our lifestyle in order to minimize environmental degradation. For instance, recycling wastewater for non-potable use, using paper judiciously, trying to have paper-free desks in our office so as to minimize the felling of trees and deforestation, and also using recycled paper. Disposable waste for recycling purposes, using organic food which has immense health benefits and which does not rely upon artificial fertilizers, chemical fertilizers. Use of public transport, as I've earlier mentioned, instead of private vehicles, or carpooling in order to use sustainable energy resources. Let's talk now about some Gandhian alternatives to the current crisis of consumption and unsustainable lifestyles being faced the world over, including in India. Once again, I quote Guha, who says that governments are compelled to pursue policies which are popular enough to win or retain office. The social needs and demands of the economy have to be made consistent with the natural constraints of ecology, and both have to be harmonized with the political imperatives of democracy. To effectively and sustainably resolve these conflicts require us to truly think through the environment, think through it morally and politically, historically and sociologically, and not least, economically and technologically. In other words, what Guha is driving at is the need for us to take on board environmental and ecological concerns in our everyday life, not merely in a cosmetic fashion, but to think deeply about them, to think about our own place within the ecosystem, to think about it and then give it a political expression which leads to political action in which communities are involved in the exercise for a sustainable and harmonious lifestyle with the natural world. Gandhi spoke of voluntary reduction of wants, and this is something which, however simple it may sound, really is extremely profound. The voluntary reduction of wants requires each and every one of us to voluntarily curtail our endless wants and desires. And in a sense, the kind of contemporary civilization we are living in has exactly the opposite imperative. Contemporary civilization demands that we keep increasing and multiplying our wants. which is in complete contradiction to ecological common sense. Voluntary reduction of wants leads to the awareness of spirituality and to view with equanimity the necessities of other living creatures on the earth. So human beings are not the only inhabitants of earth, and nor do we have the greatest stake or claim on this earth. Every creature on earth has an equal stake and an equal claim. The concept of Sarvodaya, which learners of this program have been exposed to in the earlier courses as well, which is for the greatest good of all. As you know, Gandhi did not subscribe to the view of the greatest good of the greatest numbers. Rather, he propounded the good of all. And progress has to reach or has to impact the life of the last person. That is his concept of Antyodaya, which was taken forward by other eminent Gandhians. To Gandhi, that progress did not appeal, which catered only to the welfare of a few. Gandhi also advocated trusteeship and decentralization to realize the goal of Sarvodaya. Only when one thinks of contributing to the society does one's own wealth, which will then be put for use for a noble or a collective social cause, become worthwhile. Decentralization also is an important concept which would enable the equitable distribution of the resources, as everyone would then think of the welfare of others. And this, of course, would lead to the realization of the goal of Sarvodaya. So Gandhi basically propagated a communitarian thinking rather than an individualistic, materialistic, completely individual-centered way of living in the world. To sum up this lecture, we find that if the present consumption levels and patterns dominate lifestyles in India, the effects on healthy human and ecological life are bound to be detrimental. And in fact, we're seeing this all around us today. And therefore, there is a need for a conscious revisiting of the costs of ecologically unsustainable development and Gandhian alternatives for a balanced, harmonious, and sustainable future. And these two imperatives really are the needs of the hour. Thank you.